Today we will explore one of the most fascinating and little-known chapters of European history, the belief in the undead during the Middle Ages, a period of over 1,000 years in which ghosts, apparitions, and restless spirits inhabited not only popular legends but also church sermons, monastery manuscripts, and the collective imagination of an entire continent. Before continuing with the video, remember to subscribe to the channel for more documentary narratives like this one. There is something deeply human in the way we deal with death. Since the earliest records of civilization, human beings have tried to understand what happens when life ends, where those who depart go, and if somehow they can return. In medieval Europe, these questions were not merely philosophical. They were part of daily life, from conversations whispered by candlelight to reports exchanged between travelers on dark roads and homilies delivered by monks in stone abbeys. For those people, the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead was not a rigid and impassable line. It was rather a porous membrane through which, under certain circumstances, the deceased could cross back. And it is precisely this belief, its origins, its transformations, and its manifestations over the centuries that this documentary proposes to investigate. To understand how medieval Europeans viewed ghosts, one must first step back in time and observe that the idea of spirits of the dead returning to the world of the living was not born in the Middle Ages. In the Greco-Roman world, stories of apparitions were relatively common. The Greeks believed that the existence of the dead depended on the memory the living maintained of them. The Romans possessed an entire tradition of narratives involving spirits returning due to earthly unfinished business or the need for proper funerary rituals. When the medieval period began, the belief in ghosts was already part of the European cultural fabric. What changed was the way these beliefs were interpreted, filtered, and transformed by the advent and consolidation of Christianity. In the first centuries of the Christian era, the Church's position regarding ghosts was marked by sharp skepticism. Various thinkers and ecclesiastical authorities rejected the possibility that the dead could return in spiritual form to the earthly plane. Tertullian, the prolific Carthaginian theologian who lived between the 2nd and 3rd centuries, was one of the most emphatic in this position. In his work, De Anima, on the soul, he acknowledged the existence of a vast literature on ghosts, but dismissed these reports as frauds, the product of pagan superstition. For Tertullian, the explanation was relatively simple. Any apparition that people judged to be the spirit of a dead person was, in reality, the work of the devil. Demons, according to him, possessed the power of lies and deception, and it was through this power that they created simulacra of the deceased to deceive and corrupt the living. The biblical story of the Witch of Endor, who supposedly summoned the spirit of the prophet Samuel at the request of King Saul, was interpreted by Tertullian not as a genuine spiritual resurrection, but as a demonic fraud. God would not allow, he argued, the soul of a prophet to be summoned by a demon. Augustine of Hippo, perhaps the most influential of the Church Fathers, deepened this reflection. In his writings, particularly in the work De Cura pro mortuis gerenda, on the care to be taken for the dead, he rejected the idea that ordinary dead people could return. The soul, upon separating from the body, does not carry with it physical matter that can be perceived by human senses. Visions of deceased people were attributed by Augustine to what he called spiritual vision. However, even he admitted exceptions. He accepted that angels and demons could create appearances of the dead and that saints could return to perform the work of God. But there was one point that troubled him personally. If the pious dead could visit the living, why had his beloved mother, Saint Monica, never appeared to him? This question revealed that, even for the greatest theologians, the subject of ghosts carried an emotional dimension that transcended pure doctrinal argumentation. This stance of distrust had a specific motivation. Early Christianity struggled to differentiate itself from pagan practices, and among these practices, the cult of the dead occupied a central place. For the nascent church, Accepting the reality of ghosts would mean validating beliefs and rituals that it sought to eradicate. The initial position was clear: the dead do not return. What returns are demons in disguise. However, this position would not remain unchanged throughout the centuries. The history of the medieval belief in ghosts is, above all, a history of gradual transformation. And the most significant inflection point in this transformation is linked to a theological concept that would profoundly change Christendom's relationship with the world of the dead: purgatory. Although the idea of an intermediate state between heaven and hell has older roots, it was from the 9th century onward that the Church began to more formally embrace a new liturgy of the dead. This change was neither abrupt nor uniform, but its effects were profound and lasting. If there existed a place where the souls of the deceased awaited purification before ascending to paradise, then it was perfectly logical that these souls could, under certain circumstances, come into contact with the living. Furthermore, if prayers and masses celebrated by the living could shorten the suffering of these souls in purgatory, then ghosts had a concrete reason to return, which was to ask for help. This new theological understanding opened the floodgates for a true avalanche of ghost stories throughout medieval Europe. Monasteries became the epicenters of these narratives. Literate monks, who were the primary producers of written texts at the time, began to compile and record reports of apparitions with remarkable frequency. And these stories were not mere entertainment. They fulfilled a didactic function within the tradition of exemplar, brief accounts used during sermons to illustrate moral and spiritual truths. A ghost returning to ask for prayers taught the faithful the importance of piety and charity toward the dead. A spirit reporting the torments of purgatory warned the living about the consequences of a sinful life. In this way, medieval ghost stories functioned as pedagogical instruments in the service of the Christian faith. In this context, one monastic order played a fundamental role in the dissemination of ghost narratives: the Cistercians. Founded at the end of the 11th century, the Cistercian order expanded rapidly, establishing hundreds of abbeys in rural regions. This proximity to peasant communities put the monks in direct contact with local folklore, including reports of encounters with spirits. Rather than rejecting these narratives, many monks incorporated them into their collections of exemplar, adapting them to a Christian framework. The Cistercian monk Caesarius of Heisterbach, in the early 13th century, composed the dialogues Miraculorum, Dialogue on Miracles, an extensive collection of miraculous and supernatural accounts that recorded dozens of stories involving apparitions of the dead and visions of purgatory, becoming one of the most influential compilations of supernatural narratives of the Middle Ages. Mendicant orders, such as the Franciscans and the Dominicans, also contributed to the dissemination of ghost stories. These friars, who traveled through cities and villages preaching to the common people, constantly encountered reports of paranormal phenomena. It was in this context that the association between ghosts and cemeteries was consolidated in the popular imagination. But what exactly did ghosts do in medieval stories? What were their functions, their purposes, their actions? The analysis of medieval literature, both secular and religious, reveals that the spirits of the dead played surprisingly varied roles in these narratives. The most common function, as already mentioned, was didactic. Ghosts appeared to teach something to the living, whether through a moral example, a warning about the consequences of sin, or a request that revealed the importance of charity and piety. In this sense, the medieval ghost was often a figure more sad than terrifying, more supplicating than threatening. It was the soul of someone who had made mistakes in life and now desperately sought redemption through the intercession of the living. A second recurring function was that of warning. Ghosts who had already crossed the veil between life and death possessed, according to these narratives, privileged knowledge about what awaited on the other side. They returned to warn the living about the dangers of a dissolute life, about the reality of the torments awaiting impenitent sinners, and about the urgency of properly preparing for death. This warning function reveals one of the most striking differences between medieval and modern ghost stories. While our contemporary horror stories are predominantly designed to entertain and scare, many medieval narratives about apparitions carried a spiritual and intellectual dimension that went far beyond simple fear. There was, however, a third function that made the universe of medieval ghosts considerably darker: temptation. In certain narratives, the spirits that appeared to the living were not suffering souls in search of help, but demonic entities whose goal was to lead the person to apostasy, sin, and eternal damnation. These stories directly reflected the ancient concern of the Church Fathers with the possibility that apparitions were, in fact, devices of the devil. And it is precisely here that one of the most intriguing aspects of the medieval relationship with the supernatural arises: the need for discernment. When a person claimed to have seen a ghost or experienced an apparition, the fundamental question was not simply whether the report was true or false. The question was of a deeper nature. Did that apparition come from God or the devil? Was it a soul in search of help, or an evil spirit in search of a victim? This practice of spiritual discernment became a kind of discipline within the ecclesiastical tradition. Clerics developed methods to evaluate the origin of an apparition. One of the best-known tests consisted of asking the spirit to recite a prayer. If it were able to do so, there was a chance it was a Christian soul. If it failed, it revealed itself as a diabolical spirit. In 1458, an apparently benign spirit was subjected to this test, and upon failing to recite the prayer, exposed its demonic nature. In another case, reported by James of Vitry in the 13th century, a young Catholic woman was nearly led into the Cathar heresy by an apparition presenting itself as the ghost of her deceased mother. Only after the intervention of Catholic priests who celebrated masses and prayers was the demon unmasked. This type of investigation reveals something remarkable about the medieval mentality. The boundary between the natural and the supernatural was not a clear line as we tend to imagine today. The term supernatural itself was not used in the medieval period in the way we employ it. What we today call supernatural was for the medieval man and woman simply a dimension of reality. And the investigation into the origin of an apparition was not a purely superstitious exercise. It was a rational attempt to understand phenomena that were part of the lived experience of those communities, a kind of medieval spiritual forensics. When examining the diversity of narratives about ghosts over more than 1,000 years of the Middle Ages, it becomes evident that there was no single conception of what a ghost was. Medieval Europe was not a monolithic cultural entity. It was a mosaic of peoples, languages, and traditions. French ghost stories were not identical to English ones, which differed from Scandinavian, Iberian, and Germanic ones. Each region brought its nuances, influenced both by Christian tradition and by pre-Christian beliefs that were never completely eradicated. Although some scholars argue that by the 10th century, pagan religions had been replaced by Christendom, others maintain that many of these beliefs survived in secret in rural communities. This persistence meant that the medieval conception of a ghost was, in many cases, an amalgam of the old religion and the new. One of the most revealing examples of this intertwining of pagan and Christian traditions is the phenomenon known as the wild hunt, a folk motif of Scandinavian origin. In the original Norse tradition, it was a spectral procession of spirits, often led by Odin, that crossed the skies on stormy nights. Witnessing it was considered an omen of death. When absorbed by Christian culture, the wild hunt was reinterpreted as a procession of souls from purgatory or a demonic manifestation. The most famous version of this adaptation is Harlequin's Hunt, recorded by the Anglo-Norman chronicler Orderic Vitalis in the 12th century. This capacity for transformation and adaptation is, moreover, one of the most striking characteristics of medieval ghost narratives, and it is at this point that the discussion leads to one of the most surprising elements of these stories: the appearance of ghosts. If someone from our time could show a medieval person the typical image of a modern ghost, that translucent figure floating in the air, it is likely the medieval person would not recognize it. In the medieval tradition, many ghosts were not ethereal. They were corporeal, physical, tangible, more similar to what we today would call the undead. There were reports of more ethereal apparitions, but the tradition of ghosts with a physical presence was strong. Furthermore, the spirits demonstrated the ability to shapeshift, transforming into animals, balls of light, or shapeless figures. This ability, though present in modern fantasy literature, is rarely associated with ghosts in our contemporary culture. To understand how all this manifested concretely, it is worth examining one of the most extraordinary collections of ghost stories from the medieval period, the tales recorded by an anonymous monk at Byland Abbey in Yorkshire, England. Byland was one of the largest Cistercian abbeys in Great Britain, founded in 1135 and absorbed by the Cistercian order in 1147. At the end of the 14th century, the abbey was described as one of the three shining lights of the north of England. It was in this monastic environment, immersed in the traditions and folklore of Yorkshire, that a monk whose name was never recorded made a decision that, centuries later, would reveal invaluable worth for understanding the medieval mentality. On the blank pages of a manuscript produced between the key 12th and 13th centuries, which contained mainly copies of the Elucidarium and treatises by Cicero, this monk wrote, in the early 15th century, a series of 12 ghost stories. The manuscript is now in the British Library in London, catalogued as Royal MS 15 AXX. These stories remained practically unknown until 1922, when the antiquarian and celebrated author of ghost stories, M.R. James, transcribed and published them in the English Historical Review, bringing them to the attention of the modern public. The Byland tales are remarkable for several reasons. First, they are set locally, in the rural villages and dales of North Yorkshire, describing real people with recognizable names and everyday situations of English peasant life in the early 15th century. Although written in Latin, the language of the Church, the stories clearly reflect an oral tradition circulating in the region, accounts that the monk probably heard from local inhabitants and his own elder confreres. The ghosts in these stories are not the evil forces seeking to destroy humanity, as in modern horror films. They are, for the most part, ordinary people from the community who died without confessing their sins, without correcting injustices, or without properly preparing for a good death. They are souls who cannot find peace and who return from their graves to seek help from the living. The sins that torment these spirits are, for the most part, surprisingly, mundane. In one of the accounts, the ghost is haunted over a matter of a mere sixpence. In another, the spirit of a canon from Newburgh Priory suffers torments for having stolen silver spoons. In a third account, a farmhand is punished for having fed his master's oxen with too much corn and for having allowed them to plough the land too shallowly. These narratives reveal a worldview in which even small moral failings have consequences that extend beyond death, a perspective that must have exerted a powerful effect on the faithful who heard these stories during sermons. But it is in the physical description of the ghosts and the mechanics of their apparitions that the Byland tales become truly extraordinary by modern standards. In one of the stories, for example, the ghost does not speak through vocal cords, as a living person would. Instead, the voice emanates from its entrails, which are empty and function as a kind of resonance chamber. In another narrative, a woman carries a ghost on her shoulders, and those who witness the scene observe that the woman's hands sink deep into the spirit's flesh, as if that flesh were rotten and decomposing. These descriptions reinforce the idea that many medieval ghosts possessed an unsettlingly concrete physical presence, far removed from the ethereal and intangible image we associate with ghosts today. Among the 12 tales, there is a particularly engaging narrative that deserves special attention. It is the story of a traveler who, walking along a rural road, encounters the ghostly apparition of a horse. The spectral animal does not behave like a normal horse. It rears up on its hind legs, lifting its front legs in the air in a threatening manner. The frightened traveler tries to drive the creature away by invoking the name of Jesus Christ, as the teachings of the time prescribed. The ghost horse then begins to follow him, and at a certain moment transforms into a ball of light, in a clear demonstration of the capacity for metamorphosis that so many medieval narratives attributed to spirits. This story illustrates not only the belief in the physicality of ghosts, but also the conviction that the invocation of the divine name was the primary tool of the living against supernatural forces. Another notable report in the collection involves James Tankerley, a former rector of the parish of Kirby, whose spirit wandered at night back to his old parish. Disturbed by these reports, the monks exhumed Tankerley's coffin and forced a local man to transport it to Lake Gormire to cast it into the water. When the oxen pulling the cart approached the lake, they became so terrified that they nearly drowned. The monk who recorded this story ended it with a prayer, asking that he not be put in danger for having written such things, for he had written only what he had heard from his elders. This prayer reveals the tension that existed in the mind of the monk himself, between the obligation to record these accounts and the fear that the act of writing them could attract evil forces. The byland tales are part of a much broader tradition. Scholars have identified similarities between some of these stories and Scandinavian folklore about revenants, the dead who return physically from their graves. M.R. James noted that some narratives had echoes of Danish folk tales collected by Evald Tang Christensen. This connection is not surprising, given that Yorkshire was deeply influenced by Norse culture during the Viking Age, but it would be a mistake to think that all medieval ghost stories had an exclusively didactic function. Although many were designed to serve as exemplar sermons, there were also narratives whose primary purpose was simply to scare. The byland monk seemed more interested in recording the macabre and fantastic details of the apparitions than in drawing moral conclusions. In this sense, these fragments of popular legend bear a resemblance to the modern notion of the ghost story as a narrative for entertainment. This duality between the didactic and the terrifying is one of the most fascinating tensions in medieval ghost narratives. Broadening the view beyond England and Byland, one finds an even richer landscape of ghost narratives. In the Arthurian literary tradition, spirits of the dead play important roles. In the 14th century text, the Haunties of Arthur, Queen Guinevere's mother, appears as a ghost during a hunt, presenting herself as a putrid figure covered in toads and serpents, a portrait that served as a warning about the dangers of vanity. In the Germanic tradition, Henry Buschmann, who had died 40 years earlier, appeared to his grandson in 1436 initially in the form of a dog, later revealing details about his existence in purgatory. These stories, coming from different corners of Europe, share common elements that reveal universal concerns: the fear of death without redemption, anxiety about the fate of the soul, and the search for certainty in a world full of uncertainty. But they also display remarkable regional diversity, shaped by local traditions and the degree of interaction between Christianity and pre-Christian beliefs. Over the centuries, the belief in ghosts in medieval Europe underwent significant transformations. What began as skepticism on the part of ecclesiastical authorities gradually evolved into cautious acceptance, mediated by the theology of purgatory and the practice of spiritual discernment. This acceptance, in turn, fueled an increasingly abundant production of narratives about apparitions, which spread through monasteries, churches, courts, and rural communities across the continent. At the end of the Middle Ages, the belief in ghosts was firmly rooted in European culture, setting the stage for its presence in Renaissance and modern literature. The most emblematic bridge between the medieval and the modern ghost is the apparition of the Danish king in the most famous tragedy of Western literature. When the spirit of the deceased monarch appears on the battlements of a castle to reveal the truth about his death and demand vengeance, he embodies elements that defined the ghost in the medieval tradition: the return motivated by an earthly unfinished matter, communication with the living, and ambiguity regarding his true nature. This scene is, in many ways, a direct heir to the stories told by Cistercian monks centuries earlier. The investigation into the undead in medieval Europe reveals something that transcends the historical period. It shows that humanity's relationship with death and with the possibility of an existence beyond it is a constant that crosses cultures and eras. Medieval ghosts, with their corporeal forms, their transformations, their requests for prayers, and their warnings from the beyond, may seem different from the spirits that, populate our films and novels. But beneath these differences, there is a profound continuity. Both the Yorkshire peasant who reported his encounter with a spirit to the byland monk and the modern viewer watching a horror film share something essential: the perception that death is not necessarily the end, and that the dead, in some way, remain among us. This perception, at once consoling and terrifying, is the most enduring thread connecting our world to the world of those who lived. Centuries ago, in a time when abbeys were made of stone, nights were dark, and the dead could walk among the living. If this journey through the centuries awakened something in you, if at any moment during this path you felt that chill of someone leaning over the mysteries of the past, then perhaps the medieval spirits have fulfilled once again their ancient mission of reaching the living. Subscribe to the channel so we can continue bringing you these narratives that rescue from the silence of the centuries the voices of those who came before us. Leave your comment telling us which aspect of this story most caught your attention, like the video, and share it with those who, like you, believe that the past still has much to teach us. After all, as the monks of Byland knew, there are stories that need to be told so they are not lost forever.